Revenge with Ava. They called me the office ghost long before they dared to say grandma, but the truth is I was invisible in a way that hurt more than any word. I'm Elaine Mercer, 41, and I built my career the way you build a fire in the rain, quietly, patiently, shielding the flame with both hands until it finally catches. For 12 years I worked at Stratton & Weil, a glossy corporate empire in Manhattan that smelled like expensive coffee and fresh printer ink. The kind of place where people talked about legacy while stabbing you in the ribs with a smile. I started as a junior analyst, the last one to leave, the first one to arrive, the one who caught errors before they became lawsuits, and turned chaos into clean numbers that made executives look like geniuses. By 35, I was running process audits no one else could untangle. By 40, I had the company's skeleton key in my head. Every loophole, every quiet settlement, every vendor relationship, every internal password reset pattern, every personal weakness disguised as confidence. And yet when the doors opened for the next promotion, the light never landed on me. It slid right past like I wasn't there, like I was part of the furniture. The day everything changed started with laughter. Not the warm kind. The kind that snaps like a rubber band and leaves a sting. I walked into the 11th floor conference room with a folder under my arm, ready to present the compliance roadmap I'd written over 3 sleepless weekends, my plan to stop the company from bleeding money through fraudulent reimbursements and vendor kickbacks. The screen was already on, projecting a slide that wasn't mine. A picture of a gray-haired woman in a cardigan, arms full of grocery bags, with the words, "Grandma's got spreadsheets" in neon bubble letters. They had found my headshot from the internal directory, run it through some cheap filter to add wrinkles, then plastered it onto a meme. I felt my stomach drop so hard it was like the floor went missing. At the table, people snickered into their hands. At the front, standing like he owned oxygen, was Carson Vale, newly appointed Director of Operations, the golden boy they'd flown in from a competitor and crowned like a savior. He looked at me with that smooth, practiced charm and said, "Elaine, don't take it personally. We're just keeping the mood light. Corporate's been tense. You know how it is." His eyes were bright and cruel in a way that made my skin prickle. Then he added, "Besides, you're seasoned." It's a compliment. I smiled, because that's what women like me learn to do in rooms like that. Smile so you don't shatter. Smile so they don't smell blood. I walked to the front anyway, plugged in my laptop, and started presenting like I was made of stone. My voice didn't wobble. My hands didn't shake. But inside, something hardened. I watched Carson watching me, tapping his pen, half listening, half scrolling his phone. When I brought up the vendor irregularities, names, dates, dollar amounts, he cut me off with a laugh. "Elaine, we appreciate your thoroughness, but this is operations, not a crime drama." A few people laughed again, nervous and eager, the kind of laughter you give when you want to keep your seat at the table. My boss, Margot Sutton, didn't defend me. She didn't even meet my eyes. She just said, "We'll circle back," like my work was a stray email, not the backbone of their protection. The meeting ended with Carson clapping his hands and saying, "Great energy today," while my slide deck, the one I'd poured my life into, vanished behind that meme again, as if the room wanted to swallow me whole. I went back to my desk, the open-plan prison of low cubicle walls and polite fluorescent glare, and I sat down like nothing happened. That's what they expected, for me to take the punch and keep typing. Around noon, I got the email. Subject line, org update. I opened it and felt the air leave my lungs. Effective immediately, the senior compliance lead role has been filled internally. Attached, a cheerful announcement with Carson's signature at the bottom, congratulating, of course, Jade Hollis, 27, perfect hair, a laugh like wind chimes, the kind of woman who never carried a stapler, only a latte. She had been at Stratton & Weil for 8 months, 8. And she was now my boss. She passed my desk with a bright smile and said, "Elaine, I'm so excited. I'll need your help getting up to speed." She said it like we were friends, like she didn't just step on my neck to reach the shelf. My chest burned, hot and sharp. But I kept my face calm and said, of course, because survival in corporate America sometimes looks like swallowing glass without flinching. That night I stayed late, not because they asked, but because I needed quiet. The office after hours is different. The lights dim. The fac hum turns into a lullaby. The city outside the windows becomes a glittering threat. I opened my drawer and took out a notebook I never showed anyone. In it were patterns, notes, small observations I'd been collecting for years, the way you collect seeds when you sense winter is coming, names next to dates, vendor numbers, unusual approval chains. Carson Vale's name was already in it, added in neat ink the first week he arrived, because I'd watched him in meetings, how he steered conversations away from details, how he asked for quick wins, how he smiled too hard when money was mentioned. It wasn't suspicion. It was instinct. The kind women develop when they've been underestimated their whole lives. I pulled up the vendor logs again. My fingers moved fast, automatic. I didn't need permission. I was the person who built half the reporting structure they used, and the other half I knew how to access because I'd fixed it when it broke. I followed a trail that had been nagging at me, a consulting firm called Ravelin Strategies. They'd billed Stratton & Weil for process optimization over the last 6 months. The amounts were oddly rounded. The deliverables were vague. The approvals came through Carson's chain every time, always at the end of the day, always on Fridays, always marked urgent. I clicked into the attachment archives and found slide decks with pretty graphics and empty words. Nothing real, no substance. The kind of work you can charge for when the client doesn't want to ask questions. I cross-referenced the vendor tax ID. My pulse started to thud. The registered agent name was a shell service. The address was a mailbox in New Jersey. But the phone number, there it was. I copied it, ran it through an internal contact lookup tied to the company's expense system, and it pinged. It belonged to C. Vale, listed under personal reimbursement, mobile. I sat back slowly. In that quiet office, the truth didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like a cold hand closing around my spine. Carson wasn't just mocking me. He was protecting something. He was using the company like a personal bank, and he was building a team around him. Young, loyal, easy to impress, people like Jade, who would laugh at memes and call it culture while they signed off on fraud. My first instinct was to report it, to march into HR, into legal, into the CEO's office, and slam the evidence down like a gavel. But I'd been here 12 years. I'd seen what happened to the difficult women. They didn't get praised. They got labeled, not a team player, not aligned, negative. The company didn't punish the fire. It punished the smoke alarm, and Carson had just proven he could turn a room into a weapon. I closed the files and sat in the dark glow of my monitor, thinking about what they'd taken from me. Not just a promotion. They'd taken dignity. They'd turned my face into a joke. They'd taught the whole floor it was safe to laugh at me. And something inside me, something that had been patient and hopeful, finally snapped into something sharper. I wasn't going to be their cautionary tale. I was going to be their reckoning. The next morning, I walked in wearing a navy blazer I'd been saving for the day. I put on lipstick the color of dried roses, not for vanity, but armor. I greeted everyone the same, calm, polite, unbothered. Jade waved from her new corner office, the one with glass walls that made sure everyone could see she'd arrived. Carson strolled by, tapping his phone, and said, "Morning, Elaine," like we shared a harmless joke. I smiled back. "Morning," I said. I meant it, because in my head, the game had already changed. I spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly what Jade asked. I trained her. I answered every question. I made myself useful. I became the supportive backbone she thought I'd always be. And while they saw a woman accepting her place, I was building a map of their sins. Every time Carson pushed an invoice through, I captured it. Every time Jade signed off without reading, I logged it. Every time Margot avoided responsibility, I documented her silence. I didn't hack anything. I didn't steal. I simply collected what already existed, the paper trail of arrogance. At home, in my small apartment that smelled like vanilla candles and old books, I created a private folder system on an encrypted drive. I labeled everything by date and approval chain. I drafted timelines like a prosecutor. I even recorded my own voice notes, not to be dramatic, but because memory can be questioned, while a calm, contemporaneous record is harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, the office culture around me grew louder, crueler, because Carson fed it. He hosted happy hours and called them family time. He gave Jade public praise for basic things I had done for years. He started referring to me in meetings as our institutional memory, like I was a dusty filing cabinet. One afternoon, in a hallway lined with framed magazine covers celebrating the company, I heard 2 assistants whispering behind me. "She's still here?" one said. I thought they'd retire her. The other giggled. I kept walking. I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. I just added another note to my mental list. How easy it was for people to join cruelty when it came with a paycheck. The breaking point came on a Thursday when Jade called me into her office. The glass walls made it feel like a terrarium. Everyone could see us inside, like we were an exhibit. She smiled, too bright, and slid a document across her desk. "So," she said, "Carson wants to streamline compliance. Less red tape. More agility." She said it like she'd rehearsed. "We're reassigning some of your responsibilities. Starting next week, you'll report to me directly, and your focus will be support tasks." My eyes dropped to the paper. It was a role redefinition. A demotion without calling it a demotion. Support tasks meant busy work. Spreadsheet formatting. Meeting notes. The kind of work designed to crush your spirit slowly, politely. I looked up at her. "Why?" I asked softly. She blinked, like she didn't expect a question. "It's just the new structure," she said. "Carson says we need fresh thinking, and you've been here a long time, so you know. It's time to let others shine." She leaned forward and added, "But don't worry, we'll keep you comfortable." Comfortable, like a chair they planned to leave in the corner. I nodded, picked up the paper, and said, "I understand." Then I walked out and went to the restroom and stared at myself in the mirror until my reflection stopped looking like a woman being erased and started looking like a woman becoming dangerous. That night, I made 2 decisions. First, I would not fight them in the open where they controlled the narrative. Second, I would not destroy them out of rage. Rage is messy. Rage leaves fingerprints. I wanted something cleaner. I wanted karma with receipts. So I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Daniel Klein, a former internal auditor who'd left Stratton & Weil after his own org update mysteriously pushed him out. I found him on LinkedIn, hesitated, then typed a message that felt like stepping off a ledge, Dan. "I think something is wrong here. I have documentation. If you still care about doing things right, I could use advice." He responded within an hour. "Call me tonight. Don't email details." My heart hammered as I dialed. When he answered, his voice was calm, tired, familiar. I told him only the outline, enough to make his breath hitch. "Elaine," he said, "you need to be careful. If Carson is doing what you think he's doing, he's not alone. And this company doesn't like scandal. They'll sacrifice you to protect the brand." I stared at my folder system glowing on my laptop like a secret city. I know, I said. That's why I'm not going to HR. Silence, then a low exhale. Then what are you going to do? I swallowed. I'm going to let them hang themselves, I said, and my voice sounded steady, almost cold. Dan didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He just said, okay, if you're doing this, do it smart. You need a clean chain of custody. You need to protect yourself first. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt supported, not comforted, supported. He gave me practical steps, how to keep records without violating policy, how to avoid retaliation traps, how to document threats, how to preserve metadata. He also said something that stuck to my ribs like truth. They think you're powerless because you've been polite. Polite women scare them the most when they stop being polite. The next day, Carson called an all-hands. He stood in the big conference room with the skyline behind him, looking like a hero in a movie that wasn't real. We're entering a new era, he announced. Lean, fast, fearless. People applauded. Jade beamed. Margot clapped like a seal. Then Carson's eyes swept the room and landed on me like a spotlight. And we're also celebrating some transitions, he said. My chest tightened. Elaine has been such a loyal presence here, he continued, voice dripping with false warmth. She's going to be taking a step back into a supportive advisory function. The room hummed with polite claps. I felt heat crawl up my neck. Carson added, we love our veterans. They keep the culture grounded. Veterans. Like I'd been through war and should be grateful for scraps. I clapped, too, once, softly, like I was applauding a performance. Inside, I was already counting down. Because what Carson didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the more they pushed me into the corner, the more invisible they made me, the easier it became for me to watch without being watched. Over the next week, they grew reckless. Carson approved 3 more Ravelin invoices, each larger than the last. Jade rubber stamped them with a smile. Margot signed off on an exception report without reading the attached anomaly list. It was like they thought the rules no longer applied because they'd silenced the person who cared. And every time they took another bite, I captured the crumbs. On Friday evening, as people poured out for happy hour, I stayed behind with my support tasks. I watched the office empty, the laughter fading down the elevator shaft. Then I opened the vendor portal and saw something that made my mouth go dry. A scheduled payment batch for Monday morning, totaling nearly $2 million, with Ravelin Strategies listed as the top recipient. $2 million. In one sweep. Carson wasn't just skimming. He was draining. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could stop it right there. I had access. I could flag it, freeze it, force a review. But stopping it would expose me too soon, and they'd bury the evidence before anyone outside the building could see. I needed the payment to process, so the crime would be undeniable. Karma needed a stage. I copied the batch details, exported the approval logs, and added them to my drive. Then I did something else, something small, legal, and devastating. I drafted an anonymous tip to the company's external audit firm, just enough to trigger mandatory scrutiny. No names, no accusations, only verifiable facts, unusual vendor concentration, round number invoices, rushed approvals, potential related party conflict. I sent it from a public Wi-Fi spot 2 neighborhoods away, wearing a cap and a scarf like I was hiding from the cold, not the consequences. When I hit send, my hand didn't shake. I walked home under streetlights that looked like they were holding their breath. In my apartment, I made tea I didn't drink and stared out at the city as if it might answer me. Part of me felt sick, not guilt, something heavier. The knowledge that once you light a fuse, you don't get to decide how the explosion spreads. But then I remembered the meme on the screen, the laughter, the word comfortable. And I reminded myself, they started this. I was just refusing to disappear. On Monday morning, I arrived early. Earlier than usual. The building lobby was quiet, marble and echoes. Upstairs, the office was still waking up, screens flickering on, coffee brewing, the day pretending to be normal. I sat at my desk and opened my inbox. A calendar invite popped up from Carson Quicksink Elaine. 10 minutes. No agenda. My pulse quickened, but my face stayed calm. I accepted. I saved the invite. I noted the time, because if Carson was feeling pressure, he might make a mistake, and mistakes, in my world, were gifts. I walked into his office at exactly 9. The glass walls were tinted, but I could still see shadows moving outside. Carson leaned back in his chair like a king. "Elaine," he said, closed the door. His smile was polite, but his eyes were sharp. "I've been hearing things," he continued. "Whispers. People say you're unhappy." He tilted his head, pretending concern. "I hate that. You've been here forever. We respect you." Respect. Another word they used like perfume to cover rot. I nodded. "I'm fine," I said. Carson's smile tightened. "Good," he said. Then, like a knife sliding out slowly, he added, "Because the last thing we need is someone misinterpreting normal business as something else." My stomach went cold. He didn't know what I'd done, but he sensed movement in the air. "Of course," I replied. "I understand normal business." He studied me for a beat, then leaned forward. "I'm going to be direct," he said softly. "There's a severance package on the table. Generous. You sign, you walk away, you get a nice cushion. It's time to enjoy life, Elaine. You've earned it." There it was. The quiet threat wrapped in a gift box. Leave before you become a problem. I stared at him, letting silence stretch. Then I gave him the same polite smile I'd been wearing for years. "That's kind," I said, "but I'm not leaving." Carson's jaw twitched, just once. A crack in the mask. "Think about it," he said, voice still calm, but now colder. "People who fight change here don't usually win." I nodded again, stood, and opened the door. As I walked out, I felt eyes on me from the hallway. I sat back down at my desk and wrote a note in my notebook. Carson offered severance. Implied threat. 9:06 a.m. Then I looked at the clock and waited, because I could feel it now, like thunder in the bones. The company had made its move, and somewhere outside our glass tower, the message I sent was landing in the hands of people who didn't laugh at memes, people who lived for numbers that didn't lie. By lunchtime, the first crack appeared, an email from finance, payment batch hold, pending verification, $2 million frozen. The office buzzed. Jade rushed down the aisle, whispering into her phone. Margot's face went pale. Carson walked fast, not smiling, heading toward legal. And I sat at my desk, hands folded, watching the empire tremble like it had finally felt the weight of its own sins. Knowing this was only the beginning, knowing they still thought I was powerless, and knowing that their biggest mistake was believing the woman they called Grandma didn't know how. To bury a secret or dig one up. By the time the payment freeze email finished rippling through the floor, the building felt like a body that had just realized it was bleeding, quiet in a stunned internal way, and I could feel the shift in how people moved past my desk. Slower, cautious, eyes flicking to me and away again as if they suddenly remembered I existed and didn't know what to do with that fact. Because when systems stall, everyone looks for the person who understands systems, and for years that had been me, only now I was officially support, which meant no one dared ask me anything directly, so they whispered instead, and I listened, because listening had always been my sharpest tool. Jade passed twice in 10 minutes, heels clicking too fast, her smile gone, her voice tight as she murmured into her phone about unexpected issues, and when Carson emerged from legal, His face had lost its polish, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the floor like he was measuring exits. And I knew. Then that fear had finally reached him, not panic yet, but the first honest tremor, the kind that makes people sloppy if you give it time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I worked, quietly, answering emails about formatting and meeting notes like the obedient background character they believed me to be, while inside my head I was mapping the next moves. Because a freeze is not a fall, it's a pause. And powerful men don't fall from pauses, they maneuver. They spin. They sacrifice someone smaller to buy themselves air. By mid-afternoon, an all-hands meeting hit our calendars with no warning. Subject line neutral, almost soothing, and when we gathered, Carson stood again at the front, shoulders squared, voice calm, delivering a speech about routine audits and healthy governance, words designed to normalize chaos, and people nodded because normal is comforting even when it's a lie. Then he did something that made my skin prickle. He called my name. "Elaine," he said, smiling like a benevolent king, "you've been instrumental in our compliance processes for years. Would you mind explaining to the team how these checks work, just to reassure everyone?" It was a trap wrapped in praise, a way to pull me into the light and make me complicit in his story, and for a second the room went very still, every eye sliding toward me, waiting to see if the ghost would speak. I stood, slowly, feeling my pulse steady instead of spike, because fear had already done its worst to me and I was still standing, and I said, simply, "Our checks are designed to flag anomalies for independent review, which is what's happening now." And I stopped there. No reassurance, no sugar. Just truth, clean and sharp. Carson's smile tightened, but he nodded like I'd said exactly what he wanted, and moved on, because men like him rely on momentum, not confrontation, and I sat down knowing I'd just done something small and dangerous. I'd refused to lie for him in public without accusing him. The kind of refusal. That leaves a bruise you can't point to. The rest of the day crawled, emails multiplying, rumors growing legs, and by 5, legal sent out a bland notice about temporary vendor reviews, which meant the external auditors had bitten, and that night, when I got home, Daniel called me instead of the other way around, his voice low and urgent. "They escalated fast," he said. That tip hit the right nerve. The audit firm looped in their risk partner. This isn't internal anymore. I closed my door, leaned against it, and let myself breathe for the first time all day. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "they look for a scapegoat. Protect yourself." The word landed heavy because I knew exactly who the easiest scapegoat was. A woman already demoted, already labeled, already considered expendable. The next morning proved him right. I walked in to find HR waiting at my desk, smiles too careful, voices too soft, asking me to come with them for a chat, and as we walked down the hallway, past glass walls and curious faces, I felt the old instinct rise, the one that says, keep your head down, don't make it worse. But I also felt something new, a steadiness born of preparation, because I documented everything, every conversation, every shift, and I knew my rights even if they thought I didn't. In the small conference room that smelled like lemon wipes, the HR director folded her hands and said, "Elaine, there are concerns about your conduct," and I almost laughed at the audacity of it, the way institutions reflexively accuse before they listen. "Concerns?" I asked calmly. "Yes," she said, eyes flicking to a folder, "about accessing systems outside your current role." There it was, the opening move, painting my competence as misconduct. "I access systems I built," I replied, "and I do so within policy." She pursed her lips. "Legal will review," she said. "In the meantime, we're placing you on administrative leave." The words were gentle, but the intent was sharp. Remove me from the building, cut my access, isolate me before I could do more damage. I nodded, because arguing there would only feed their narrative, and I handed over my badge and laptop like a woman surrendering weapons she'd already hidden elsewhere, because the real evidence was safe, duplicated, time-stamped, and waiting. As I walked out past the lobby, past the security desk, the city felt louder, harsher, like it was daring me to blink, and for the first time since this started, doubt crept in, thin and poisonous, whispering that maybe I'd gone too far. Maybe I'd underestimated how much power they had to crush me quietly. But then my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. They just requested archived approvals going back 18 months. That's not about you. I stood on the sidewalk, exhaust and voices swirling, and let that sink in, because it meant the auditors weren't buying Carson's story, and that meant the ground under him was already cracking. Being on leave was supposed to silence me, but it gave me something precious. Time. Time to organize, to prepare, to think 3 steps ahead instead of reacting, and I used it, because revenge isn't loud when it's effective, it's methodical, almost boring. I spent days at my kitchen table, sunlight moving across the floor, building a narrative that wasn't emotional, wasn't personal, just factual. A clean line from Carson's arrival to the sudden surge in Ravelin payments, to Jade's promotions, to Margot's approvals, to the attempts to sideline me when. Questions arose, and I rehearsed it not like a victim, but like a witness, because witnesses are harder to dismiss. Then, on the 4th day of leave, my phone rang with an unknown number, and something in my chest tightened when I answered, because the voice on the other end wasn't HR or legal. It was calm, measured, female. "Elaine Mercer?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "This is Angela Brooks with the external audit team. We'd like to speak with you." I closed my eyes, just for a second, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because this was the moment everything hinged on, and I said, of course, and meant it. We met the next morning in a neutral office downtown, all glass and quiet professionalism, and Angela didn't waste time, didn't flatter me, didn't threaten me. She just laid out the facts they'd found so far, and as she spoke, I recognized my own notes reflected back through an independent lens, which is a strange thing, seeing your private suspicions become validated by strangers with authority. "We have reason to believe there's a related party conflict involving Ravelin Strategies," she said. "We're still confirming." I nodded. "I can help," I said, and I did, carefully answering questions, providing documentation, never editorializing, never speculating beyond what the evidence supported, and when she asked why I hadn't raised concerns internally sooner, I told the truth without bitterness. "I tried," I said, and when that failed, I documented. Angela studied me for a long moment, then said, "You understand this may have consequences." I met her gaze. "I understand," I said, because by then, consequences felt like an old acquaintance, not a threat. The fallout was swift in ways I didn't expect, and slow in others that tested my patience. Stratton & Weil announced a voluntary leadership review, which everyone knew meant someone was about to be fed to the wolves. And within a week, Jade was reassigned pending investigation, her bright confidence collapsing into brittle politeness when she texted me, out of nowhere, "Did you know?" About this? I stared at the message, thinking about all the times she'd smiled while stepping over me, and typed back, "I knew enough to be careful," which was true and kinder than she deserved. Margot went on medical leave, stress-sided, a classic corporate disappearing act, and Carson fought. He sent emails dripping with indignation, hired a lawyer who specialized in reputation management, and leaked a narrative to the press about overzealous auditors and internal sabotage. And when my name appeared in a vague way, described as a longtime employee with grievances, I felt them. Old anger flare, hot and familiar, but I didn't respond publicly, because public fights are what men like him want. They thrive on noise, and I was building something quieter. Instead, I did the hardest thing. I waited, trusting the process I'd set in motion, trusting that truth, when documented well enough, has a gravity all its own. Weeks passed. My savings thinned. Friends asked careful questions. Nights stretched long and anxious, and there were moments, alone in the dark, when I wondered if justice was just another word people used to stay hopeful. But then I'd get an email from Angela with another confirmation, another thread pulled, another lie unraveled, and I'd remind myself that this wasn't about winning a job back. It was about refusing to be erased without leaving a mark. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon when rain streaked the windows and the city looked washed raw. "Elaine," Angela said, "we've confirmed ownership ties between Carsonville and Ravelin Strategies." My breath caught. "Direct?" I asked. "Indirect, through a trust," she said. "But it's clear." I closed my eyes, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness, because even vindication carries grief for the time you lost believing in systems that didn't believe in you. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "the board is involved." When Stratton and Weil finally spoke publicly, the statement was careful, bloodless, full of phrases like ethical concerns and ongoing investigation. But behind the scenes, the reckoning was brutal. Carson was placed on leave, then quietly terminated, his golden image cracking under the weight of facts he couldn't spin away. And when his resignation hit the internal feed, the office buzzed again, this time with a different energy, a nervous recalibration. People suddenly rethinking old jokes, old loyalties, wondering who might be watching now. I wasn't there to see it, but I felt it anyway, like a distant thunder rolling through my bones, because power shifting always leaves an echo. HR called me after that, voices warmer, apologetic in a way that felt rehearsed, offering to discuss next steps, and for the first time, I had leverage, real leverage, not the fragile kind that depends on goodwill. I asked for everything in writing. I asked for guarantees. I asked for an external mediator. And when they asked if I wanted my old role back, I surprised myself by saying no, because the woman who wanted that job had been hurt in ways I couldn't undo, and I wasn't interested in crawling back to a place that only valued me when it was scared. Instead, I asked for something else: recognition of retaliation, a settlement that reflected the damage done, and a public correction of the narrative that had painted me as a problem instead of a protector. And they agreed, because companies will pay handsomely to close chapters they don't want. Remembered. When the agreement was finalized, I sat alone at my table again, papers spread out, pen heavy in my hand, and as I signed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear, like fog lifting to reveal a road I hadn't known I could take. And I realized that revenge, the kind that lasts, isn't about watching someone fall. It's about reclaiming your own gravity, your right to take up space without apology. And as I sealed the envelope, I knew this wasn't the end of my story, just the end of the part where they thought I was done. Because what they still didn't understand, what they'd never understood, was that women like me don't disappear when you push us aside. We observe, we adapt, and when the moment comes, we speak in ways that make it impossible to pretend we were never there. When the wire hit my account, I stared at the numbers longer than I expected to, not because of the money itself, but because of what it represented. A quiet acknowledgement that I hadn't imagined any of it, that the years of being overlooked, mocked, and minimized had finally been weighed and measured in a language corporations understand. And yet the strangest part was how little it satisfied me, because revenge, when it's real, doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It arrives with a stillness that forces you to ask who you are when the fight is over. I didn't rush to celebrate. I didn't post anything. I didn't even tell most people what had happened. I boxed up the last physical reminders of Stratton and Weil, the branded notebook, the stress ball, the framed years of service certificate that suddenly felt like a relic from a life that wasn't mine anymore. And I let myself grieve, not just for the harm they caused, but for the version of me who believed loyalty would be enough. In the weeks that followed, Messages trickled in, cautious and apologetic former colleagues admitting they'd suspected something was off, but hadn't known what to do, hadn't wanted to risk their own positions, and I read them with a mix of understanding and distance, because survival makes. Cowards of good people, and I wasn't interested in punishing them, only in moving forward without carrying their fear with me. Carson tried once to reach out, through an intermediary, a carefully worded note about misunderstandings and shared mistakes, and I deleted it without replying, because I'd learned that the most complete revenge isn't confrontation, it's irrelevance, and he no longer had a place in my story. Jade sent a longer message, full of regret and self-pity, talking about how she'd been young and pressured and didn't see the signs, and I read it twice before responding with a single line. I hope you learn to ask better questions, because absolution isn't something you hand out just. Because someone finally feels the consequences of their choices. As the noise faded, something unexpected happened. People outside the company started reaching out, quietly at first, then more openly, women in similar roles, who'd heard fragments of my story through professional back channels, asking how I'd known when to act, how I'd protected myself, how I'd survived the aftermath, and I realized that what I'd done wasn't just personal, it was transferable, a blueprint for navigating systems designed to exhaust you into silence, and the idea lit something in me that Stratton and Weil never had. I began consulting, selectively, advising organizations on compliance and ethical risk, but more importantly, mentoring individuals on documentation, boundaries, and the power of patience, and for the first time in years, my expertise wasn't treated like background noise. It was sought out, respected, paid for without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The skills they dismissed as old-fashioned were exactly what others were desperate for when the shine wore off their own corporate fantasies. One afternoon, months later, I found myself at a conference, standing backstage waiting to speak on a panel about governance, the room buzzing beyond the curtain, and as I adjusted my jacket, I caught my reflection in the mirror, older than the woman in that cruel meme, yes, but sharper, steadier. And I smiled, not the polite smile I'd perfected to survive, but a real one. Because I knew then that my power had never come from titles or promotions. It had come from attention, from the willingness to notice what others ignored, and from the discipline to act when the moment was right. When I walked on stage and spoke about accountability, about how cultures rot from the inside when cruelty is mistaken for confidence, I didn't mention names. I didn't need to, because the truth has a way of recognizing itself in anyone who's lived under its absence. And afterward, as people lined up to talk to me, I felt something close to peace, not because I'd won, but because I'd transformed pain into something useful. Late that night, back in my apartment, city lights blinking like distant signals, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, thinking about how easily my story could have ended differently if I'd accepted that severance, if I'd walked away quietly, if I'd believed them when they implied my time was over. And the thought didn't make me bitter, it made me grateful, because it reminded me that resistance doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like staying, watching, and choosing the exact moment to stand. I thought about the younger women who might one day face the same laughter, the same patronizing smiles, the same attempts to make them doubt their own clarity, and I hope they'd remember this, that systems fear memory more than anger, that documentation is a form of self-respect, and that silence, when chosen strategically, can be louder than any accusation. As I finished my wine, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for the next day's client call, a new company, a new challenge, and I smiled again, because my life no longer revolved around proving my worth to people who couldn't see it. It revolved around using it where it mattered, and if there was one last lesson Stratton and Weil had taught me, unintentionally and at great cost to themselves, it was this: underestimate a woman long enough, and she won't just leave your world behind, she'll reshape it, quietly, deliberately and on her own terms.
Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. I'll catch you in the next story.